Why is it that we even need to talk about intergenerational justice? For almost all of human history, didn't we naturally care for the next generations and often sacrifice ourselves for that to be the case? How are we now in a situation where if we just do what's natural, what's instinctual, if we just wake up each morning and do what our culture and our economic system and our governmental systems lead us to do, we harm the future? How did we end up in that kind of a world? Well, I suggest to you using secular language, and one of the things that's interesting is that lots of things can be spoken about in secular ways or religious ways, and both are legitimate. Religious ways usually include personification, that is, giving human characteristics to what's not human, what's more than human. I mean, we can't understand the world's myths and religions, period, if we don't understand our brain's propensity to relate. And we typically have related instinctually by giving human characteristics to what's more than human. Most gods and goddesses throughout human history are personifications. They're not persons. They're not disembodied entities. Gaia was a personification of Earth. Gaia was not the goddess of the earth or the spirit of the earth. Gaia was giving Earth a proper name and a personality, and it was personifying, consciously or unconsciously. And the Earth is inescapably real, and we'll either honor Earth first before humans, or we will perish. Poseidon was not the god of the oceans. Poseidon was a personification of the incomprehensibly powerful and capricious seas. You didn't find atheists 2,500 years ago saying, I don't believe in Helios. Whatever you mean by this is what I'm talking about. The sun is inescapably real. So I don't even use the word God anymore in terms of spelling it G-O-D, because most people think of a supernatural being that you either believe in if you're a theist or you disbelieve if you're an atheist. So I've started spelling God, G-O-D-D-E, God. Actually, there's a number of pagans and Catholic nuns that have begun doing that, and it's the Old English spelling. That's how God was spelt in Old English, and it's gender neutral, because reality is feminine-like, male-like. It's like a lot of things. And we need to either live in right relationship to reality, or we will perish, just like every other species. We're no special than any other species in terms of we have to live in right relationship to primary reality. Whether you use secular language or religious language for primary reality, it doesn't matter. What I'm talking about includes the air, the water, the soil, and the life upon which we depend. So the reason that everyone in this room can wake up and just do what's natural and what's instinctual and what our economic system and political systems lead us to do, and yet harm the future by that, is because our economic system measures progress in anthropocentric, that is human-centered ways, rather than life-centered or God-centered, G-O-D-D-E, that is biocentric ways. We have an economic system. I mean, you tell me whether you think this is an accurate description or not. We have an economic system that rewards the few at the expense of the many by design. It measures progress by how fast we can take the biosphere and turn it into pollution, and forces billions of us to betray the future just by pursuing the good life. So as a religious person, I'm going to use religious language that you normally never hear in Unitarian churches. I'm going to call that kind of an economic system demonic. Because if the word demonic has any meaning in a modern context, it's got to apply to a system that makes it easy or inevitable for billions of people to betray the future. See, good and bad, right and wrong, have always been defined by how we impact the larger community of which we're a part and how that ripples out to the future. If I do something kind and generous and helpful to you, or that's helpful to the future, I've done a good thing. If I harm you or harm somebody or harm the future, I've done a bad thing. If I sacrifice to be a blessing to others of the future, I've done a great thing or a heroic thing. But if I'm an individual or corporation and I serve my own needs, screw others. To hell with the future. I've done an evil thing. Right? This is not moral rocket science. And so An economic system that makes it easier or inevitable for billions of people to harm the future is demonic. And the only reason it is demonic is because it's human-centered, not God-centered. And again, I'm not meaning anything otherworldly. I'm meaning life-centered, biocentric. It's giving the environment a personality. It's relating to the atmosphere, the soil, the forests as a thou to be related to honorably, not an it to be used and exploited by us. Thomas Berry, my great mentor, he died about 8 years ago. He was one of the most significant ecological and evolutionary thinkers of the 20th century. He said, the environment is not our surroundings, it's our source. But notice, if we call primary reality the goddess, or we call primary reality God, G-O-D-D-E, or if we call primary reality the environment, we're likely to have a very different reaction or relationship just by what we call primary reality. So what we name things matters. The idea that we can have a growing GDP, a growing gross domestic product or gross national product, that is the idea that our economy can grow while primary reality becomes worse and worse and worse, whether you call that unsustainable, insane, or evil really doesn't matter. It doesn't have a future. Anything that's not sustainable at some point won't be sustained. And we're living in one of the most radically unsustainable economic systems ever devised by humans. And it's largely because we measure things in human-centered ways. And the interesting thing is, it's not a surprise how we got here. Let me just give you a little window into this whole world of what I call grace limits, because there is a profoundly science-based understanding of how we got in this mess that when you get it, it goes like, oh, wow. It's almost like it couldn't have been otherwise, but it also gives us freedom to now deal with the challenges we're dealing with in a way that has more passion, because we're not expecting that things are going to keep getting easier and easier and better in the way that Connie shared very vulnerably, what most of us are feeling, which is, you know, throughout the 20th century, we just always assumed that every decade would be a little better. And there'd be setbacks, but every decade would be a little better, a little healthier, a little easier, a little wealthier. More people would live in a more comfortable way. And what we now know is it would take 6 to 7 planets of resources if just the people in China and India lived like the people in this room. There's not enough planet to take our waste, and there's not enough planet to supply the resources. So how did we end up like this? Well, let me give you just a window into this. Carrying capacity is the most important ecological concept, and I also consider it the most important theological concept. I call it grace limits, that every bioregion, every island, every continent, and the planet as a whole has a grace limit. That is, there is a limit to how much resources we can take and how much waste we can exude before the systems start breaking down. See, science tells us that there are certain things that all sustainable cultures throughout human history had in common. And the most important thing they had in common was that their economy mimicked ecology. That is the ways of nature, the primary way that the natural world actually works was used as a model for how humans would interact with each other in terms of exchanging gifts and resources and, you know, time and all that stuff. Our economic system doesn't do that. How did we get there? Well, one of the ways is that Europe was at saturation. Europe had achieved population pressure. Europe was starting to have too many people, so it was rapidly degrading the soil and the forests of Europe. And then an entire new hemisphere was discovered. And because of the European diseases that went ahead of most of the Europeans, it wiped out 90% of the Native Americans in North and South America. So it looked like, from the European perspective, it seemed to be an uninhabited continent. And we know from scientific study that any species that all of a sudden has access to a habitat that it didn't have access to before, that's conducive for it, population goes skyrocketing. And there's this exuberance of spirit. It's like life is good. There's this sense of limitless possibilities. And this is true for all species. They feel that way. We can measure the hormones. So when an entire half a world was discovered of resources, timber, and then metals and minerals and all kinds of animals, I mean, my God, more than any Europeans had ever seen. There was this sense of exuberance and population. When you look at human population over the last, say, million years, it's this, it slowly grows, there's declines, it's slowly, very slowly. And then when the New World was discovered, and very close after that, we started mining 500 million years of stored sunlight, fossil energy in terms of coal and then oil and natural gas. Those two things, having a whole new hemisphere of resources and cheap concentrated energy, population, boom! And this exuberant sense that anything is possible, this limitless. It's called carrying capacity surplus. There was more than enough resources and more than enough ability to absorb our waste. So all of the institutions and the mindset, the habits of our thinking, and embodied in our cultural institutions that arose in America reflected carrying capacity surplus. The problem is we now live in a carrying capacity deficit world. We no longer have the resources to support even the population that we now have, much less the people in China and India living like us. So this mismatch between the reality of a carrying capacity deficit world and the reality of a mindset and institutions that reflect carrying capacity surplus, that is the fundamental predicament of humanity. It's not a problem that can be solved. See, we're used to, one of the things we've gotten used to in the West, in America especially, is the sense that everything is a problem, that if we just throw enough energy at it and enough human ingenuity, we can solve problems. However, what we're now discovering is that there are certain things that are not problems that can be solved. There are predicaments that we have to evolve with, deal with, adapt to. Like death is not a problem that can be solved. Death is a predicament that we have to deal with and live with. And we can either resent it or we can embrace the reality of it, and it makes a huge difference in terms of our emotional state. So one of the things that science tells us is that there are 24 previous examples. There are hundreds of cultures that we know about. Actually, it's more than 1,000 cultures that we know about. But there are only 24 complex city-based civilizations. And all 24, we're the 25th. So the industrial humanity is the 25th complex civilization. There are 24 previous examples of complex civilizations that have become great, and then their own greatness becomes their own undoing. And then over a period of 1 to 2 centuries, they decline, and then there's a dark age. And then another civilization arises, it becomes great, often in many different ways than previous ones, but they all grow old and die together. That is, they all unravel politically, economically, socially in very predictable ways. It's kind of like our bodies grow old and die in very predictable, scientifically understandable ways. And if you don't know that we're in the decline and fall of the American empire, where 5% of the world's population take 25 to 30% of the world's resources for our benefit, if you think that's going to continue forever, or if you think that that's not going to be ending in the next decade or 2 or 3, you're out of touch with the reality in your thinking. So then when things happen on the global stage, you're going to be frustrated because your expectation is this, when in reality, it's this. It's not this. The collapse of the Roman Empire took 325 years. It was a stair step, and there were partial recoveries. That's the way empires and civilizations contract and collapse. And we are 40 years, America is 40 years into catabolic collapse. That's what the Rust Belt is. The Rust Belt is that we have overextended what we can afford to maintain, and now we're feeding on ourselves. And that's what all 24 previous complex civilizations contracted with catabolic collapse. And if we don't know that, then we're going to be frustrated at why it is that the current election happened and some of the things that are happening politically right now. We're going to be frustrated and angry and upset. But if you understand what God, reality with a personality, when I use the word God, all I'm meaning is reality with a personality, not a person outside reality. Okay? It doesn't matter whether you believe in reality or not. I'm talking about the biosphere personified. What reality is telling us is that we're in contraction. And when we understand that, our hearts can soften. And we can be about the work of justice and peace and sustainability and all the things that we Unitarians are fabulous at and are committed to. We can be about that work, not from the place that we expect that things are going to keep getting easier and easier, but we know that we are planting the seeds for healthy culture, healthy religiosity, healthy localized. All roads lead local. We are quickly going to say goodbye-bye to globalization because we can't afford the energy of shipping grapes from Chile to Michigan. This cheap, abundant energy that has allowed our population to go skyrocketing and allowed our expectations to go skyrocketing is going bye-bye. So over the course of the next 150, 200 years, there's going to be a population decline and a decline in damn near everything. And if you understand that and you say, oh, right, okay, we're right on schedule, then you're not frustrated. Then the current election happens and you don't go, oh, no, this shouldn't be. But you say, oh, right on schedule. I've been expecting you. Come on in. There's this welcoming spirit that isn't about just accepting injustice. It's not about accepting toxicity. It's not about accepting poisonous relationships to other people. But we engage in that work from a place of compassion and from a place of generosity. Like that's the mission there, to nurture courageously, to spiritually courageous people who transform the world through justice and compassion. The transformation of the world is not about just the next few decades. It's about the next few thousand years. It's about planting the seeds for healthy forms of culture. And that's the great work that we're in. Humanity has come, you could say this. One of my favorite quotes from Robert Louis Stevenson. He says, sooner or later we all sit down to a banquet of consequences. Our species is in the great reckoning. We've been out of right relationship to reality, whether we use secular or religious names for reality, it doesn't matter. We've been out of right relationship to reality, and we are now about to experience consequences of biblical proportion. That's the great reckoning. It's unavoidable. This is not a problem that can be fixed. This is a predicament we're going to have to deal with. But it could also be the great homecoming. Humanity, the prodigal species, we squandered our inheritance. We're waking up to our predicament in the pig pen, as it were, and we're coming home to reality. We're coming home to the biosphere. We're coming home to God, G-O-D-D-E. We're coming home to the goddess, whatever you want to call the living world, personified or not. We're coming home to primary reality as primary. And that's, if you only remember one thing, I invite you to remember this sense of intergenerational justice. Could any vision matter more? It's simply honoring the past and letting the past guide us, letting past generations guide us for how we can live in the present in ways that are a blessing to the future. We can't do that unless we learn from ancient cultures who did it and did it successfully for a long, long time. 98% of human history, we lived sustainably. That is, we lived in a way that didn't diminish the quality of primary reality. And we know how they did it. They had a humble I-thou relationship to primary reality. They didn't believe in spirits. They related personally to reality. So when the Native Americans and other indigenous peoples talk about the tree people and the cloud people, what that is relating in a personal, respectful way with the various aspects of reality. See, anthropology, Western anthropology, has taken us down a totally dead-end path by thinking of gods and goddesses as disembodied entities that you either believe in or you don't. No, we need to relate in a humble, respectful way to primary reality. It's basically realizing that primary reality is primary. And we'll either relate that way and our economic system will honor that fact first, or we will go extinct. And that's the only thing that has to shift. If we make this one shift, the shift from thinking in human-centered ways to thinking in life-centered ways, so that here's the only sustainable economic system in the future will be this, where we measure success and progress on a decade-by-decade basis by how well the soil is doing, decade by decade, by how well the forests are doing, decade by decade, by how well the fisheries are doing, decade by decade, by the CO2 in the atmosphere, decade by decade. Measuring progress in life-centered ways is the only way into a just, healthy, and sustainably life-giving future. And we Unitarians can be leading the religious communities in the West because we're the only major religious community that is not still stuck in what I call the triple idolatries. The idolatry of the written word, the idolatry of the otherworldly, and the idolatry of beliefs. See, we value evidence as modern-day scripture. We value evidence as more authoritative than old men and old books. We recognize that justice doesn't stop with humans, but justice includes other animals, and justice includes the future. So we've got to step ahead. But I encourage you to just deepen your own knowledge. If you just Google Grace Limits Audios, I have 1,000 hours or more of books. Like I consider it sustainability scripture. These are the most inspiring books and essays that I have ever been exposed to. And I've been asking other scholars over the last 5 or 4 years, I've been asking, what are the most inspiring readings that you know of about right relationship to primary reality and right relationship to the future? And I've recorded all of them, and they're all free. It's all up on my website for free, Grace Limits Audios. I encourage you to deepen your knowledge base in that, so that then when the craziness and the challenges and the stupidities that happen in our culture, you're not caught off guard, but you're engaged to even be more passionate in your activism, your social justice work, your ecological justice work, your pro-future work. Because I think that's the fundamental distinction of our time, pro-future or anti-future. The most important distinction of our time, and I'll conclude on this note, the most important distinction of our time is not left or right or conservative or liberal or communist or capitalist or socialist or none of that stuff. The most important distinction of our time is pro-future or anti-future. Do our theologies, our philosophies, our practices, our institutions, our laws, do they help us live as a blessing to the future, or are they causing us to live in a way that's a curse to future generations? This is the most important distinction of our time. And there are people of every religious tradition. There are people that are staunch atheists. There are people of every skin color and ethnicity and gender orientation and everything else that are pro-future. And that's our in-group. Our in-group isn't just the people like us. I know I'm preaching to the choir here, but this is something that's vitally important, and it's very exciting. I'll be going into this in spades on Tuesday night. I have my program Tuesday night. It's just a lot of slides. It's gorgeous visually. And I encourage you to invite whatever email communication you get from the church office that mentions about Tuesday night, cut and paste it, and invite your non-UU friends and family. Let's fill this place Tuesday night with non-UUs so we can introduce them to the kind of bridge-building, pro-science, pro-future message that we Unitarians sometimes even take for granted. I'd like to close with a quote from Joanna Macy, one of my great mentors. She wrote a book called Active Hope. See, that's what this is leading us to. It's not passive hope, but active hope. There is science now to construct the story of the journey that we've made on this earth, the story that connects us with all beings. Right now, we need to remember this story, to harvest it and to taste it. For we are in a hard time. And it is the knowledge of the bigger story that is going to carry us through. Amen.